Great to have you all back again, and a real privilege. We were just saying at least 3 of us have never been on the Abbey stage before. So being in this space full of all the history and memory that's here is a real privilege. So thank you for the opportunity, Fiach. My name is Shona McCarthy. I have worked in the cultural sector in Northern Ireland for 25 years. And most recently as the head of the Londonderry UK City of Culture. Which was really a kind of phenomenal experience in the history of the North, and kind of really resonated with me, the conversation over the last couple of days about the power of art to create a different set of conversations. And I saw that and witnessed that at first hand on a city-wide level, as I saw a whole city engage proactively in public celebration of art and also in purposeful inquiry. So I just wanted to set out my stall and say that's who I am, in an Irish city, predominantly nationalist, with a minority community who are very, very allied to their Britishness, hosting the first ever UK City of Culture brought with it its own boundaries, barriers and walls. But that's a story for another day. So it's a great privilege to be here. I also was just awarded an Eisenhower Fellowship, so have just spent 8 weeks in 10 different cities with over 70 meetings across the US. Another place that has an interesting, if not physical, set of walls and barriers to overcome itself. But on to our discussion this afternoon and our panellists. I'm privileged to be amongst this brilliant group of people. I'm going to introduce all 3 of them first, and then let them do their presentations uninterrupted. And then we'll move to Q&A. And my other job here today is to be a very rigid timekeeper, so that we can hopefully open it up to a conversation. So first of all, we have Dr. Brendan Ciarán Browne. Brendan is Professor of Transnational Justice at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem. He has conducted qualitative research with former political prisoners, ex-combatants, children, young people and political representatives in conflict and post-conflict environments, including Belfast and Palestine. His most recent appointment is as Visiting Research Fellow in the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation and Social Justice at Queen's in Belfast. And here he is continuing his research on children and young people in conflict and the role of commemoration in conflicted and transitional societies. And this afternoon, he's going to focus on 2 subjects: the walls in Belfast that still exist and how that city is going to commemorate the Easter Rising in 1916. Our second panellist is Stacey Gregg. Stacey is also from Belfast, and this did strike me when you're talking about walls and barriers. Who do you put on the stage but 3 Northern Irish people and a Palestinian? Her previous work at the Abbey Theatre includes Perv and Cows Go Boom for the Abbey's 20 Love season. Her first play, As Many, was shortlisted for the Royal Court Young Writers Festival. She has built an impressive portfolio of work for both stage and screen, including Grand Tour, Lagan, Override and many more. Stacey was one of the playwrights featured in Payne's Plough's Come to Where I'm From season, and she has been on commission with the BBC, RTE and Channel 4. And this afternoon, she is going to talk about, in part, the context of her play, which will be read later today, SHIBBOLETH. And finally, we're privileged to have, and some of you may have seen his play, which has been running over the course of this symposium. Amir Nizar Zuabi is a Palestinian writer, one of the leading emerging theatre directors in the Middle East. His award-winning shows have gained new audiences locally in Palestine, but also internationally at acclaimed festivals and theatres as a director and a writer. As a director, his theatre work includes Alive from Palestine, When the World Was Green, and many more, including Oh My Sweet Land, which Symposium audiences have had the privilege to experience on the Peacock stage throughout this event. In 2008, Amir founded ShiberHur Theatre Company and has produced 6 shows with the company, all touring extensively in the 48 lands and the occupied territories. Amir graduated with honours from Israel's prestigious Nissan Nativ Acting Studio. And we're looking forward to hearing from all 3. So if I can invite Brendan to the podium. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I too would like to say how much of a privilege it is to be here. And I'd like to publicly thank Fee, but also Jan and Kelly for all their correspondence and hard work, because they got a lot of emails from me. So I'd like to thank them very publicly. Just over 20 years ago, Northern Ireland reached a seminal moment in its recent turbulent history. The IRA declared a cessation of hostilities on the 31st of August 1994. And for many people here in the auditorium, that day will be ingrained in the mindset. So too can I remember very specifically when, as a little boy, my dad explained the significance of this moment. And despite being somewhat of a false dawn, the moment signified the beginning of a long and at times arduous process of post-conflict transition, in which major steps forward were taken amidst continuing, seemingly endless setbacks. And whereas my father's generation lived through the conflict, I like to consider myself a child of the transition, which I believe in turn allows an opportunity to perhaps analyse the state of post-conflict Northern Ireland through a new and unique lens. 20 years on represents a good opportunity to reflect on this process and to analyse and debate through this panel discussion the impact of the continuing barriers to peace, both the physical and the metaphorical, with a specific focus on the continued and expanding segregation of Belfast. So for the next 10 minutes, and I assure you it will be 10 minutes or so, I want to focus on two main issues. Firstly, the segregated nature of post-conflict Belfast and the role of the peace walls. And secondly, in keeping with the overall theme of the symposia, namely commemoration, I will give an insight into the commemoration of the 1916 Easter Rising in Belfast, the choreographed nature of the events, and how these commemorative rituals have become windows into the fragmented nature of Irish republicanism in the north of Ireland. So, before I say too much more, I want to state from the outset that I love Belfast. Anyone who knows me is aware of just how much I love Belfast. I enjoy the people, the culture, the heritage, and the crack. And for me, it's very important for me to state that when I'm going to be a wee bit negative for the next wee bit. Belfast is a city in transition. People often make reference to Belfast and the North as being a post-conflict society. However, I prefer, as many others do, the term transition. Since the peace agreement in 1998, immeasurable change has happened, change that for many seemed intractable. In fact, it's fair to say the transition has been remarkable. People no longer enter the city centre through the Iron Gate. They no longer shop for fear of being bombed, and for many, Belfast has become a city mirrored on other European capitals with a growing consumerist culture. However, behind this change does lie, at times, a darker reality. Belfast does remain a city divided, ideologically, religiously, culturally, but for the purposes of our discussion here today, also physically. A network of oxymoronically named peace walls, separation walls, interfaces, barriers, whatever you choose to call them, carve up my home city, creating strangers and dividing Catholic and Protestant communities along traditional ethnic markers. Proposed in 1969 by the British Army as a temporary measure to keep two warring factions apart, these supposed temporary measures have become permanent and semi-permanent features of the landscape. They vary in shape and in size, ranging from barbed wire fence to concrete slab, reaching 7.5 metres tall at their highest point. The Belfast Interface Project has calculated that over 100 of these walls and divides exist, stretching and expanding to over 34 kilometres. I'm very aware that that figure seems somewhat trivial when you listen to Ray's talk earlier on 700 kilometres, but there are a couple of issues that we need to realise here. What is truly remarkable is that in our supposed post-conflict environment, these peace walls and barriers have in fact increased, leading to the argument made by colleagues and scholars in Queen's, Brenton Murda, Peter Sherlow, amongst others, that people growing up in certain parts of the city live comfortably segregated. So, what then is the impact of these walls and divides? Much research has been done to investigate them, as I've mentioned, Peter Sherlow, Brendan Murda, among others. And I have been involved in continuing research with at-risk and vulnerable children and young people in the city. This has shed a further light on the class divide that is at the heart of this issue. And therefore, one key point that you can take from this is that peace walls are erected in areas of Belfast with significant and alarming levels of childhood poverty. The location of these walls maps directly onto areas of Belfast with the highest levels of socio-economic deprivation, thus further emphasising the level of structural inequality that continues to be a feature of our post-conflict transition. And in fact, speaking to many middle-class children and young people, many would often struggle to tell you where these peace walls exist, or say to you that they've never actually seen one, despite the fact that there are over 34 kilometres. The second point to make is that these walls become physical markers of territory, designating areas that are considered safe and or dangerous, an issue that is, of course, particularly pertinent for children and young people growing on or alongside these many divides. It's perhaps also not surprising that research has linked the peace walls with location and incidences of sectarian violence. Young people living on or alongside the walls learn very quickly the areas of their own communities that are safe and that are not. And by and large, these are directly linked to the barriers. Now, often there is the usual clamour to tear these walls down, and perhaps this is where we're going to come into conflict ever so slightly, usually coming, in my experience, from detached political representatives or from observers from afar, many of whom are painfully removed from the reality on the ground. And whilst nobody can argue against the idea in principle, after all, who wants to live in a city with an expanding network of physical divides? There is relatively little engagement with the needs of the communities living on or alongside the wall themselves, many of whom who have been interviewed and asked about these issues feel that the wall is a necessary evil to retain their safety. This begs the question, who then are we to dictate to people how they should feel when it comes from removing these barriers? The notion, painfully and upsettingly, is that removing the walls anytime soon, I fear, is a folly. There are, of course, many community-led programmes and a wealth of interested parties involved in cross-community engagement. And these actors play a crucial role, a key role in trying to ensure that communities on both sides become more integrated, diffusing potentially volatile situations and, in effect, maintaining the peace. However, the role of cross-community contact schemes has been widely debated, with little evidence to suggest that temporary contact between children and young people on both sides of the barriers does any good in the long term. There's also the point that the walls have become big business, with throngs of tourists making their way to see our wee post-conflict city that has struggled to really move on. And it may be painfully cynical of me to say, but it could even be suggested that former combatants and ex-prisoner groups who hold tours of these peace walls may be slightly reluctant to see the removal of the walls for fear of a drop in revenue. What is needed, I argue then, is a more concerted effort to support these most deprived areas, areas where the wall is a permanent feature, to help these communities move beyond the crippling poverty that they live in, to provide opportunities and hope, and to address this deep-seated structural inequality. The focus should be to shift the emphasis towards helping communities, in my opinion, helping separately, who have lived behind these barriers of mistrust and fear for the best part of 40 years. Only then will we be in a position to remove these walls, physical reminders of our imperfect and at times fragile peace. The second area I want to bring to the table today is the issue of commemorating the Easter Rising in Belfast. And I know this fits well into the overall theme of the symposium, if not directly onto the panel discussion. And it really is a great pleasure to be able to share with you some of the issues I've been investigating now for the best part of 5 years. Arguably the most defining moment in Irish history, the commemoration of the Rising has been analysed by a range of groups and academics and historians, amongst others. However, overwhelmingly, the focus has been on how the Rising is commemorated in the South, with relatively little work turning a critical eye north of the border. Whereas great efforts are made to emphasise togetherness and homogeneity in the South, in Belfast, the commemoration of the Easter Rising becomes a who's who in rival Republican circles. I've actually referred to the events in the past as a chronicle of factionalism. At the time of the last count, when I spent an inordinate amount of time sitting in Milltown Cemetery, there were 7 separate commemorative events to remember the Easter Rising that take place in the city, stretching from 9 a.m. on Easter Sunday morning and coming to a close late on Easter Monday afternoon. The format of the events is similar across the board, with each of the various groups making use of the cemetery, an area that is sacrosanct in Republican circles. The events are organised and planned in such a way as to ensure choreographed segregation and division. They're stage managed to ensure that no 2 commemorative rituals will ever collide. Parading routes on the Falls Road in Belfast are arranged in advance with different meeting times and spaces. Similarly, in the cemetery itself, there are separate areas and plots in which to gather, all of which are adorned, of course, with faction-specific symbolism. The need to ensure segregation at the events is historically embedded, and the need for this division varies depending upon the group with whom you speak. A number of groups are keen to highlight and emphasise the violence that has been a feature in the past when 2 commemorations have come together at the same time. People have, in fact, lost their lives at these events. However, for the smaller Republican factions, the need for separate events is to ensure their own unique brand of Republican identity is retained. The organisation of separate events is viewed by some factions as an act of resistance, as a way of protesting against the stance taken by Sinn Féin as the dominant Republican Party in the North. So the key point to make here is that these commemorations are not solely acts of remembrance. Rather, they are inherently political acts, opportunities to discredit rival groups, and as such, they are events that are politically charged, meticulously organised, and wrapped in a web of iconic Republican imagery. The fragmented and divided nature of the events in the North mirrors the state of Irish Republican politics in the present day. And whereas in the past, when the Troubles were at their most intense, fewer events took place, with the need to appear cohesive and united more pressing than ever, it's actually Northern Ireland's transition into a more peaceful environment that has impacted positively on the number and volume of these events. All of which then has led to an increase in separate interpretations of republicanism, which is in turn publicly performed on the day. Organisers of the events attempt to make use of the commemorations to emphasise their position as the true inheritors of the legacy of 1916. Important Republican symbols become contested battlegrounds, with the memory and legacy of Connolly in particular being a source of intrafactional conflict. In addition, groups creatively make use of the symbolically important Easter lily, with some choosing to wear the pin on their left lapel to denote their left-leaning politic. Others choose to position their lily upside down, would you believe, in an outward attempt to express dissent with the current direction of the Republican leadership. Similarly, other groups carry the flags of the United Irishmen to emphasise their continuous and unbroken lineage to the ideals of the foundation of the Irish Republic. All of which leads to the conclusion that the commemoration of the Easter Rising in Belfast is a contested and deeply divided affair. And whereas in the past the events would have taken on the role of sending a powerful message to an outside audience, to the British government, to security forces, or to loyalist paramilitaries, a message that suggested very strongly that we're still here. As we have moved forward in our transition, the events assume a much more inward-looking role and are thus about discrediting Republican credentials of political rivals, challenging the narrative of the dominant, and highlighting the complex nature of an ever-evolving Republican identity. Physical battles at the events were a fixture of a fraught past, and subsequently, it is the graveyard and the pulpit that have become the new weaponry by which to express dissent, generate resistance, and reaffirm existence. Thank you very much for listening.
Right. Thanks for having me. There's a wee bit of overlap here, I think, but that's good. It means we must be right. So, in 2008, the Abbey Theatre and the Goethe Institute commissioned me to write a play as part of an international response to the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. My subject was the interface barriers that separate communities across our region. Unlike other barriers of international conflict, this wall is generally wanted by the communities around it, restricting movement but not vital supplies, a nuisance and an oddity to most, a blot that no one feels strongly enough about to address wholeheartedly. It just is, running among us, exerting its force, mythically anonymous. Brick by brick by brick by, I grew up around work sites, among bricks, the sand, the men. Boundaries and no-go zones crisscrossed the landscape of my childhood. We were moved out of a tense Belfast city centre to the sticks, as my granny called it. It wasn't the sticks, it was just a new build estate in Greater Belfast, a mile or two closer to the hills and the tractors. For those in the areas most affected by conflict, everything and nothing has changed since peace. They exist in different worlds. This is what the woman in the shopping aisle says, or the expat journalist in Sao Paulo, or the girl in the coffee shop to tourists Ron and Karen from Toronto on those embarrassing occasions when trouble kicks off and them lads are out on the street again. Belfast is thriving, we've moved on, why can't they? But what about the walls carving up the city? Sure, the tourists pay to see them and money from tourism is money for all, right? And those walls are fascinating. But how do you write about them? Why would you? I holed up in Berlin and thought about walls and humans. The play didn't present itself, but it knew it was a cacophony, chaos and bacon buddies and bricks and rain and men on a work site building a wall. I called it SHIBBOLETH, a Hebrew word for words or customs one tribe uses to mark itself apart from others. A linguistic wall of sorts. And the word SHIBBOLETH has an epic feel, doesn't it? Awesome, I had a title. But at script meetings, I struggled to express my thoughts. I was stumped by this bloody wall, and feeling insane by now, I suggested they fire me, but instead, we workshopped the draft. That was 2010 as the recession really set in. While writing that draft, I was working for Liberty, a British organisation that campaigns for civil liberties and human rights. At the time, the British Prime Minister was pushing a bill through Parliament that would enable detention for 90 days without charge. After London's July bombings, young British Muslims were inheriting a stigma reminiscent of that attributed to Irish people in Britain some decades earlier. But they exist in a different world, thought British voters. In 2011, London was on fire, and even lovely liberals scratched their heads and condemned the rioters in nice, reasonable voices, nothing to do with deepening inequality, social immobility, global recession. They exist in a different world, brick by brick by brick by. In 2012, Obama visited Northern Ireland, which he congratulated with a caveat. The world is watching you and your inspirational piece, but you have more work to do. Shibboleth raised its tiny fists from its drawer. Too right, Barrack? Shortly after, following an attempt to limit the flying of the Union Jack at Belfast City Hall, the flag protests erupted. Themans live in a completely different world, exclaimed the vox poppers on our TVs, as we shared another meme of that crazy woman demonically screaming, "No!" through the smashed jaw of Belfast City Hall. That summer I went on a Belfast City tour for the crack. I found myself atop an indifferent double-decker, ogling into the cramped backyards of inner-city terraces, a stone's throw from the shipyards where men would once have flocked for work. A small boy wrapped in a flag defiantly punched his fists in the air back up at us. His mum brushed her hair and a broken scooter splayed obscenely across the grass. Boys, 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 brick by brick by brick. Last year, when horror gripped Gaza, flags popped up again on Belfast streets, only for once it was they live in the same world. However, the desire to map that conflict along the dichotomous lines of Northern Irish politics lost nuance and humanity as it escalated. I guess nuance rarely survives the great modern gauntlet of soundbite and clickbait. Anyway, since starting SHIBBOLETH across the years and under dreams and at the back of the hall at too many family funerals, I've been haunted by boys. Poor boys. Our boys aren't doing well at school. Our boys struggle with pride, employment, self-worth. Our boys take it out on people that aren't like them. Our boys are killing themselves. Violence turns inward, depression soars. The suicide rate is highest by far among young working class men, increasing by over 64% in the last decade of peace. One finding suggests as many have died by suicide by now as were killed by the Troubles. And relative poverty in Northern Ireland manifests itself along sectarian lines, along the walls. In the areas that don't have the new shops, people have been left to harbour fears that might sound wild or alien or ignorant. But these are people who exist not in a different world, but one for which we all share responsibility. And those who judge often do so from positions of relative security, privilege, or distance. And while paying lip service to poverty, we can't at the same time conjure up a so-called culture of poverty or a culture of violence without acknowledging our professional and middle classes' implication in economic segregation in this destructive environment which they experience little of themselves. In the last decade, the global spike in inequality has seen economic walls rise across the world. Neoliberalism is so ingrained in our culture that it is almost invisible. But it's not the only way. It hasn't always been. We know in our bones we can be better, fairer, but we're in the grip of a great profit machine that's been set to auto rather than manual. Humans can challenge that. And the oppressed must challenge their own oppression. Around the wall in Belfast, it's the will of the people who live there that'll change things, for who has anything else to gain from rocking that boat? If the wall were to come down, would trouble flare? Then we mightn't be able to go shopping. And lots of people will purse their lips and talk gravely on the news about threats to growth and retail figures. And in the current system, this is where policy really gets made. But this is also, therefore, the measure of what needs to happen. If it's unclear what financial profit can be made in removing the walls, the incentive must be a moral, human one. Rebuilding our economy and image is important, but not at the expense of all else. The finely balanced boat needs a wee rock. Brick by brick by brick by, because the startling thing to most outsiders about Northern Ireland is that many people want the walls, or rather aren't ready and can't imagine life without them. The walls are literal and psychological and in the very quick of us. Thousands died in a very small area, and it's the interface areas around the wall that suffered most and will be hardest and slowest to heal. And until then, our kids will be yet another generation born into the shadow of division. The kids. Well, here's a lovely shaft of sunlight. In Northern Ireland, there's less than 7% integrated schooling. And yet, according to a 2013 poll, over 79% of parents would like the choice of sending their kids to a mixed school. Here's a big whack of the problem wrapped in its own solution, and yet achieving it is tortuously slow, because the will of the people is unmatched yet by those in office. Those schools aren't being built. The opposite of building is subtracting, and cuts to funding and reduced access to higher education is what we're seeing. Because our government is an aging man still privileging sectarianised equality over genuine inclusive equality. He's the cringy uncle everyone wants to put to bed. Don't be too hard on him, though. Northern Ireland lurched into a peace that has, with periodic blips, sustained. We're a success, first and foremost. We're light years from where we have been. But in our desire to preserve peace, let's not ossify structures that have no vision, that lack hope and humanity. We have a promise now that the walls will be down by 2023. If government's an uncle, then peace is a teenager, as likely to slam a door in your face as present you with an unexpected cup of tea. But then a process is by definition something under construction, as long as the work's getting done and they aren't all playing Candy Crush. I guess the main thing is that they themans, never exist in a different world. I think it's a question of empathy and optimism and education, and I'd rather knock my head against that bloody wall and sit on the rewards of an as yet incomplete peace process. So I wrote a flippin' play. A play, sure, what use is a play? An English friend recently remarked how sci-fi the walls seemed to him, and that kind of tickled me. I guess they are. So on that note, I want to finish with this sci-fi and fantasy novelist Ursula Le Guin's words, spoken in relation to books, but pertinent to art generally. She said, "I think hard times are coming when we will be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now and can see through our fear-stricken society and its obsessive technologies to other ways of being, and even imagine some real grounds for hope. Books, you know, they're not just commodities. The profit motive often is in conflict with the aims of art. We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begin in art, and very often in our art, the art of words." Thanks.
Hello. I'm a Palestinian from the 48 territories, which means, by definition, saying I'm a Palestinian is challenging somebody else. But my family lived there for centuries before the State of Israel was initiated, and by the fact it was initiated, didn't turn us to something else. So I insist on calling myself Palestinian. And working in the Galilee, in the Arab community, the Palestinian community in the Galilee, has its own challenges. We are the forgotten million, if you like. And these challenges are big, and of course they're in relationship with the challenges that the Palestinians in the West Bank have. We come from segregated communities, and there's a constant effort to keep us apart. And one of the things that my company is trying to do since it was founded was to work subversively against these very, very big efforts to separate us. Now, we live in a segregated community as well, because we live in a neighborhood, our nemesis is our neighbor as well, so it's this kind of very complicated reality. We live among our occupiers on a daily basis. It's complicated. It's a good beginning to do theater, from my point of view. And in Palestine, everything is political. You know, growing lettuce in the Galilee is a political act. Everything is political. That's who we are. This is our great tradition. We grew up through the trouble. I'm sure it's very similar to Ireland. We grew up counting the dates of the wars, the events, the political upheavals. That's who we are. That's who we define ourselves to be. So that's one big tradition in Palestine. And being a theater practitioner, that's always on the table. But politics is an act of reduction. It's an act of reducing who you are to a title. It's building a wall. You keep on building new walls. The other big tradition that my people have is poetry. Our holy book is written in poetical verse. That's who we are. This is our real core tradition, because we don't have theater, really. It's a new art for us. And in a way, in the marriage of both these traditions, I found a voice. My company found a voice, because the act of poetry is the opposite act of reduction. The moment you have a metaphor come in, the moment you have colors coming in, a word, something creeps. If politic is absolute, so poetry is the complete opposite of that. And in a way, that's the whole attempt for me, from where we come from, to create more and more works that are not assuring what you believe, but offer question marks and maybe compassion. Working in my company has its challenges. We're always asked, what are the red lines? What are the walls? What are the barriers that we allow ourselves to cross? Our relationship with our neighbors, our relationship with the establishment we live in is very, very complicated. It's not simplistic. There's no bad and good. There's no evil and justice. And of course, in the big map of things, you know, in the lecture earlier with the map, it's very clear-cut, it's very obvious. But the same walls that are there to keep the West Bankers in are meant to keep us out. It's very funny, we're not allowed into the West Bank. It's a felony. We get arrested if we're caught. They don't always apply it, but we do. Now, me and a man from Ashtar, we meet regularly. I don't care. It's easier for me. She can't come out because she'll really be in trouble. I only get kind of told off. But this is a constant effort to break these walls and barriers that exist. And again, there's walls and barriers that exist inside us in the way we define ourselves. Again, we start reducing ourselves to a political cause, to a nation state, to who we are. But we're complicated creatures. Palestinians, like Irish, we existed before 48. We existed before 67 war. My grandmother used to pick olives on the groves of Kufr Kanna. And that's part of who she is. That's part of the landscape. That's part of the landscape that's engraved in me. And I don't want to reduce myself only to a list of wars and a list of upheavals. Today I live in Jaffa, which is banks in the center of Tel Aviv, if you'd like. We're completely surrounded. There's a small Arab Palestinian minority that's fighting to keep a voice, that's fighting to keep its culture, that's fighting to keep its right to say the words, I am a Palestinian, which is not obvious because, of course, again, it's a challenge to your neighbor, to your next door neighbor. Jaffa was one of the richest, most beautiful, most cultured cities of Palestine prior to 48. When the war started, most of the people of Gaza of Jaffa became refugees in Gaza. And I had the dubious pleasure of spending this summer in Jaffa while there were the sirens because of the missiles from Gaza, missiles, you know. And of course, every house in Jaffa, every minority house, every Palestinian house in Jaffa was looking to Gaza, where the rest of the family is. And it's a very schizophrenic reality we live. Great for theater. And in a way, I want to keep it short, but I don't have a really good intellectual reason for reading what I want to read for you. But this was written during the war, and in a way it sums up everything we are trying to do. It sums up the reduction, and it's my attempt to defy the definitions of walls and barriers and cutting Gaza out of the world and out of geography and cutting the West Bank out of Palestine and cutting Palestine out of Palestine. So this is my small attempt to defy this. And I'm dyslexic, so I'm sorry. 10 years, 7 operations later, the mission is completed. Upper Gaza is totally abandoned. All of Gaza has moved underground. Men, women, and children, a great mass of people. We dug entire neighborhoods, streets, highways, schools, hospitals, theaters. We dug a mirror image of the land we abandoned above. We gave up on the dream of getting out of Gaza Strip. We gave up on the promises of somebody lifting this blockade. We gave up on the promises of finding a fair solution. We gave up on hopelessness. We gave up on hunger. And we decided to take action. We, who were attacked from the sky, from the sea, from the fields, who had 1-ton bombs dropped on our heads in pointless rounds of killing and violence, we decided to turn our back on life. We, who were forgotten by the world, decided to pay it back and forget it right back. Having despaired of fear of blood, the only refuge left was earth. So we buried ourselves alive. 10 years later, now, after we started digging, the mission is complete. Deep, deep beneath the living world, there is an entire city. Gaza Ghetto Underground. It's moldier, it's chilly, and it's a lot bigger. Here you can barely hear the huge bombs exploding above. And the only hint of the tanks smashing the streets is a slight tremor in the ceiling. We dug down into the soil of Gaza through the layers of time. Sometimes we found bones, remnants, a room containing a long braid of hair, Samson's braid, or Delilah's thigh bone, that bone that once supported the flesh of a widespread leg. And we found broken pillars of an ancient temple. And on one we saw faint etching. I pray thee, God, may I be avenged of my enemies for at least one of my 2 eyes. This sandy soil of Gaza was always the ally of desperate people. And we kept digging deeper and deeper. With bare hands, with cracked fingernails, we dug so deep, so far, that we canceled out the blockade, and we canceled the borders, and all these definitions of the upper world. We dug underneath all that rubbish, and then we kept digging even further, straight into the core of earth. We realized a subterranean right of return. At first, we could still hear the clamor of Tel Aviv above us. We heard the propaganda, the herds shouting, "Death to Gaza, death to Arabs, death to artists, death to anyone who doesn't applaud, death to anyone who doesn't get in line, death to life." And we heard the sound of the footsteps that grew more and more synchronized until they became a military march that trampled everything above. And we didn't want to hear anything, so we kept on digging so deep we reached the river Styx. And Ciarán, that old boatman, gave us a helpless look and turned away. What could his small boat do to help the people of Gaza? So we swam to the other side, to the cold, rocky bank, through this murky river of life. And slowly, slowly, we became white, like tallow, and we didn't hear anything anymore. Not the Western double standard or the bombs, not the psychological state of our attacker. Here we hear only the constant mechanical gnawing of the earth. Here in the dark, there is only pure, solid despair. And in the silence, we started to hope. We start to hope that if we keep digging all the way to the core, if we don't stop, if we perforate this land like a honeycomb, if we make it as thin as lace, maybe then suddenly it will collapse in on itself. And then like a trail piled with cups of coffee and cookies that crashes in one movement to the floor, in a mess of crumbles and glass, everything will mix together. The upper part and the lower part will be blended in, and the rules will change. And we'll be able to say with a sigh of relief, here is a shred of the sky mixed with a cracked piece of sea. Here is saja'iyeh mixed with shderot. And here is zaytun mixed with jabal al-zaytun, with the mounts of olives. And here is compassion mixed with relief. Here is one human being mixed with another. And we'll know that we're saved from the living death in which we were trapped. And we'll join the free life above. And the entire people of Ghetto Gaza underground will rise to the surface, pale and faded, blinded by the sun. And we'll stand in silence looking around us as our eyes adjust to the light. And as we stand there, a fear will crawl into our heart. A fear that while we were finding refuge in a subterranean ground, the land above has took its own life. It was abounded, and it's dry like a bone. Thank you.
Wow. I'm delighted to say that we still have good 40 minutes for questions. I think that was a real kind of provocative, three very different, even though some of it overlapped, presentations that we had. And I guess I would like to come back to all three of you, really. I'll ask a couple of questions first, and then I'll open it to the floor. Your question, Stacey, you know, what difference can a play make? And I throw that back to Brendan as well, because if we don't set out the aspiration, at least, that at some point the walls just might come down so that we don't have to go subterranean and create another landscape, you know, where is the hope then? And what role is there for the artist in this transition phase that we find ourselves in? So what difference does a play make?
Hello? Oh. I mean, you know, the artists are arguably the ones, you know, who go out, and I think it resonated so much, this idea of digging deeper and being subterranean, and in a way, I think there's a little bit of that in me writing a play at all. It's not sort of literal. People, it's very unlikely these days anyway that here anyway people will come and see a play and go, well, that's it, I'm not voting the way I was voting before tonight, you know. But it's about contributing to the discourse, you know, contributing to the conversation, contributing a new voice, a new idea, and giving people, I think, liberating people to collectively consider or think about or talk about, you know, alternatives to what maybe becomes a bit stagnant or normalized, or, you know, as is in the case in conflict and post-conflict areas where the abnormal becomes normal. And so I think that art is one of the most beautiful ways and the most natural ways to interrogate that.
Yeah, I agree with that, but there's no problem in being aspirational. I think I said that in the paper as well. I said, we're all aspirational. We want the voice, of course, but we got to create the environment, and we got to create a scenario where there is hope. And I think that's very important. And if art transcends that, and a theatre can do that, that's very important. But this goes back to the economic argument as well. We got to create an environment where children and young people can feel that there is an alternative, and that is an economic argument, and that's my point. Very much so.
Can we go back to Amir? Because very clearly in your own journey, there's literally a danger, a personal danger involved in the work that you do every day. Can you tell us a little bit more about your own personal journey to to becoming an artist and to using your words as a means of contributing to the conversation in your own place?
There's not really a physical danger as such. You know, for a while I worked inside Ramallah at the heat of the Intifada. That was dangerous. Where I work now, there's no physical danger, but there's a constant attempt to redefine who we are. You know, there's no need to romanticize this as being this glorious feat. We're theater practitioners. It's not very different from here. What I'm very lucky to have is the people I work with, the people who do the mistake and work with me again and again, are very passionate about the world they live in. And as Palestinians, nobody becomes an actor because it's fashionable. So they're misfits. We're all misfits in our society. And that's an advantage, because then people, and for me, that's the first requirement about theater. Theater was made for us to react on the world we live in. That's the way I perceive it. It's the most humane of arts. It's the most immediate of encounters. And as such, it provides this platform where you can say something immediately. I can say something to Stacey now on stage and it will become real. It's not manipulated and very manipulated at the same time. And I think that is the effort. Now, we have nothing, we have no infrastructure back home. We have no tradition. Our feet is, every step we do is the first step in the desert. So we've got different practitioners. We're all linked, we're all one family. But we work, every one of us has his own small, segregated almost journey. And we do try and meet, but it's down the Palestinian theatrical scene, which is much more vivid than its numbers. If you compare the amount of things we do to the numbers of practitioners, you'll be shocked. But it's down to massive feats, personal feats of the practitioners themselves. People like Iman that carved a company out of thin air. So it's down to these people that create small theaters, small scenes that are very vivid, very lively, and of course they're fueled by the fact our reality is unbearable, to say the least, or challenging, or the biggest danger is mental danger, I guess, and that's true in Ireland as well for practitioners.
Yeah, thank you. Can I open it to the audience? And if you have a question, can you raise your hand? There are roving mics around the place. Yep.
Yeah, being aspirational and creating the environment, I would agree with. But just going back to the barriers that exist in Belfast and the fact that there doesn't seem to be a complete commitment among what we would call Republican left-wing organisations on the commemorating 1916. Is this not a true fact that to keep those barriers against working class people, because that's what it is, it's the ghettos that are actually fighting with one another and behind these walls and these barriers, that as Paddy Cockburn said yesterday, that the fear factor is good insofar as it makes the politicians look good, that we're protecting you from one side and we're protecting you from the other side. What I was going to ask was as where are the leaders, and if it's working class against working class, which seems to be in Belfast, rather than the people who are appearing on the television, and both in Ireland and worldwide, who are talking about, like the Obamas, talking about the great peace process, aren't living behind these walls. And does the fact that history is not taught in our schools, it's not part of the curriculum, particularly of 1916, that we're losing the students and the younger generation to the fact that they would not be fully aware of the history of Ireland, whether it's north or south. We still have the same problems, I think, here in the south in commemorating 1916, because we don't know what's happening. There's no plans that have existed. Organisations that should be involved are being excluded from the main commemorations which are going to take place. They're being organised by a Fine Gael Taoiseach who would not be the one that we would say would be steeped, that party would be steeped in the history of 1916. So we have a long way to go as well. But my main question is that those barriers and those walls that exist, and Stacey said that the will of the people will change things and then we can go shopping. But you can't go shopping unless you have money in your pocket. So, I mean, it's a capitalist thing. Keep the walls there. Keep the people fighting between one another. And I don't know where the leaders are, where they're coming about. I hope they didn't go on for too long. But I think it was the three contributions were excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Brendan first on this one. I think the question is about education and leadership.
Yeah, well, I think it's it's a well-known fact that certainly the Protestant Unionist loyalist community in the north of Ireland have suffered significantly in recent times with a chronic lack of leadership. I mean, especially since David Irvine passed away in East Belfast. I mean, and that's very stark. If you go up and have a look around East Belfast, the Newtonards Road, Castlereagh Road, Beersbridge Road, you'll see areas that are very high levels of childhood poverty and deprivation, and a lot of that has come since leadership has been removed from that. So I absolutely agree with the point there, 100%. I think in Republican circles, it's always a race to the left. In the north, it's always, can I be seen to be more left-wing than Sinn Féin? We now have a situation in the north, you've got the sticks and now you've got the super sticks as well. So maybe it's just a case that we need to be seen to be more and more working class than our working class partners, our working class Republican groups. So that's what I would say on leadership anyway.
Can I just throw out something else on this one, though? Because a number of years back, I was responsible for a major pot of funding in Northern Ireland, and it was a very kind of unique position for me, because before that, I'd always been looking for money for things, and have been since as well. But I remember we were doing some work around the walls, particularly the longest wall, the Shankill Falls peace line. And I spoke to an ex-prisoner in that area and was talking to him about this possibility of money and to do some work in the area. And he automatically talked about the need to do work with young people and to do work that was a deep delve into community relations and young people from each side of the wall working together creatively and through art. And I said, God, that seems really odd to me. It was a man called Billy Mitchell, an ex-prisoner. And I said, that seems really odd to me, Billy. I would have thought you'd have been looking at skills and training and job creation for these young people. And he said, so I said, I would have thought it would have been more of an economic argument. And he said, but Shona, if I get these young people into a job, what I've got is a bigot in a job. So it's just another way to look at it, and it was another perspective that came from that very community itself, that possibly the focus on economics is not really at the heart of our problem always. We have other issues to look at as well. I'll throw that back to you, Brent.
Absolutely. I mean, I would hate to say another bigot in a job. I would disagree with that, but I would say as well, certainly in recent times during the flag protests, and not to be a cynic about it as well, but there were plenty of, inverted commas, cross-community groups rubbing their hands when what was kicking off, because all they could see was another couple of million going into their cross-community project, and cross-community projects that hadn't delivered very much, and very much not delivering very much on the ground, and they should be creating jobs and opportunities and education, because only through jobs, opportunities and education can you then challenge those stereotypes as well. And that's in my opinion. But obviously art and theatre and things like that, that's not my background, but I know that it's maybe where I can pass down the line and say to you, Stacey, if you wish.
I agree with everything. I would say as well, maybe I wasn't clear, but like I'm quite ambivalent about the shopping myself. You know, I don't know if it's the answer to every problem. I think it's probably in the middle of what we're talking about. It's a question of the quality of the opportunities that are available, and allowing and inculcating the young people around those areas with more of a sense of self-worth and possibility. And you know, that's going to be the intersection of a couple of different things. So I know that's not the most satisfying answer, but no quick fix.
Can we take another question from
Hello.
Can we ask you to keep it to questions rather than statements? I know Faith keeps saying that.
Well, I'm not a member of any political organisation, so I have no statement to make. And that, or the council for that matter. But I'm old enough to remember when the Troubles weren't on, 1968. I remember when they started, and I remember when they were over, so-called. So I can get the scope. And you do talk about walls being barriers, where I can tell you those barriers were there before those walls were over there. You know, and I don't see any kind of art or literature removing the prejudice or the hatred that's in Belfast. I'm a native of Belfast myself. And I can tell you the worst we had was maybe a punch-up when we were kids, and that you didn't think about it, and that you didn't associate yourself with any particular organisation. You were just a kid, and you run around and you did kid things, and these things happened. But my question to you is, do you think all this this business of theatre and art will really change attitudes that have been there? They've been there for centuries. They've been there for generations, and when you experience the effects of them, what people will tell you that they hit you. You know, I mean, no doubt about it. And that I think that the useful maybe for raising some kind of consciousness of the situation outside of Northern Ireland, but I don't think any kind of stage Irish entertainment or any kind of play, that no matter how deep or philosophical or sociological, is going to shift the attitudes of some people. It just isn't until there's real and serious institutional change. And the question I want to put to you is, do you think rather than sort of helping change, you're actually preventing it?
Oh my goodness. Could I just ask what you mean by preventing change?
Well, it's kind of like here we have our arts, and here we have our literary sort of efforts and that. But I can tell you, they don't reach lots of the community. That's the community don't even know they're on. It comes then up on the radio, on the TV, in a middle class fashion. Like, here we are, it's all sorted, it's done. We've got a play about the famine, grand, great, and that, you know. But there's people I know never go to the theatre.
Me too, my family. Though, so I completely hear you, and I think that there's been quite a discussion recently, it's been in the press, about whether or not our responsibilities towards creating opportunities in art for people from working class backgrounds is being seen through. So that is kind of a hot topic, and I agree with you there. But I also think don't think that's a reason not to continue doing what we're doing, but to keep pushing and make sure that there are community projects, that there is outreach, that the work that's being made doesn't just go out to the same old marketing lists. And there's been the likes of in the north anyway, the building of the MAC, which is a beautiful integrated arts venue and is in the centre of the city as well. You don't need to get a bus out, which unfortunately held people back maybe from going out to the Lyric in the day. It's smack dab in the middle of the centre. The facilities are free. It's open longer hours than most other places in the city. You can get a coffee and sit there all day and use their free internet. I do. And, you know, that's a slow change, and hopefully things will continue in that direction. So it's a build towards making the arts more accessible, towards normalising that, towards making people feel like they're entitled to go and do and see those things as well. I know I feel it very keenly as well, so I totally sympathise with what you're saying. But I don't think that it's a reason to not do it. And quite frankly, the first cross-community projects I ever got involved with were through the arts, and I'll be forever grateful for that. And most of my education and exposure has been through getting involved in the arts. And I know that's my subjective experience, but, you know, there you have it.
I had kind of hoped we'd moved on from that sort of, you know, the arts are a middle class sort of pastime kind of argument, because, I mean, certainly my own experience of what we saw in Derry over the City of Culture year, I mean, there's more and more developments in terms of arts practice moving outwards. So much of what we did over the course of that year was in the public realm. We had young people from Orange Bands working with Hafez Schechter to reproduce a Derry response to Political Mother. We had 1,000 local people performing The Return of Colm Kill, working with Frank Cottrell Boyce and Walk the Plank. I mean, it's kind of, I think there's more and more ways in which the arts do engage, and certainly even my own team in the Derry City of Culture year, we're all working class Derry people. So I think that idea that kind of the arts is stuck in some sort of middle class sphere isn't really, and it kind of worries me that that sort of argument translates into, we now last week had a leak through the BBC that the 12 government departments in the north are going to reduce down to 9, and the Department of Culture, Arts and Leisure will now become the Department of Communities, Welfare and Sport. So I think, yeah.
I would also just add two little points. One is it's not an Irish-centric problem. You know, it's a problem that's you know, global really, with increase in inequality and with an increase in segregation between the middle classes, the working class. Even people might not use that language anymore, but with a greater division and a greater sense of entitlement at the top and a lack of entitlement at the bottom and a lack of opportunities and a lack of social mobility. You know, these problems will only get worse at the moment. I've forgotten my other point. It was a really good one. Never mind, I'll remember and then I'll tell you.
Can we throw it back out to the audience?
I just wanted to go off on a different tack. I excuse myself for that. I want to ask Amir, particularly because I thought your talk was absolutely extraordinary. And have you worked at all in crossing the border, the invisible wall between your community and that of the Israeli community in terms of the arts? I ask it on the basis my son set up a few years ago a project in Bosnia-Herzegovina in a small town called Bridgecow. I'm probably pronouncing it badly, but the project still lives, which is the important thing. And it was working. That's a town where they brought back where Serbs were there, and Bosnians are living there, and they had to have sniffer dogs in the schools after the Serbs' children went into school, and then for the afternoon the Bosnian children went in. And it was a pretty bad scenario, and he worked with the kids in making musical instruments. It was the only thing he could think of to bring them together. So it wasn't exactly theatre. I did some theatre as well with them, but the making of musical instruments was very important, because then they played on their extraordinary instruments, and the various parents came and talked to each other for the first ever time. So it's still living as a project there. Is there any possibility, because the picture you paint is so very black, is there any possibility of doing this in Israel?
There's one very big difference, which, God be blessed, the war in Serbia and former Yugoslavia has ended. The war in Palestine from 1948 until today is one long stretch. There's lulls, there's play pretend, there's talk of two-state solutions and Oslo Accords, which are all part of a war. And yeah, I'm bleak, I'm not optimistic. Every time I have Israeli friends and I have Israeli friends, my wife is a Jewish Israeli, I'm not. But every time there's a round of violence, they all rally up to the flag. So my personal experience with the false notion of coexistence is completely, I don't hate them. I have very limited resources and energy, and I want to put them into my community. I hope they do the same with their community, because from my point of view, my major task is to get my community that's big. You know, I'm not that vain to think that I can really change anything. coming back to the Irish discussion. But working with the people around me, making them see things in a different light, making myself see things in a different light, is where I find my real task, finding my voice, finding my community's voice. And we still have a lot of things to deal with. The others are there. I hope one day we can meet on equal grounds, but there is no way to meet when somebody's sitting on your shoulders, talking about the good restaurants in Tel Aviv, while he's blockading Gaza and people in Gaza have their calories counted. It's too far-fetched to go, now this is a Western fantasy. Now, your Western fantasy, and I respect it, your Western fantasy of us savages and them savages running on the beach, holding hand to hand to a beautiful sunset, is fine, but it has nothing to do with the reality. Now, I meet them on the street. They're lovely people. Some of them are really close friends of mine. But the regime is evil. And the regime is the problem. It's not the people. The people are people. Some of them are stupid. Some of them are nice. Like Irish people, like Palestinians. But the mechanisms of power mean that all these attempts are fake. To begin with, we need to solve the big war, and then I'm sure we'll have much more love affairs. I hope I'm not trying to be polemic or ethnocentric, because it's not about that. But it's it's imaginary. It's La La Land for us to talk about coexistence. Now, the East always had coexistence. We always had Jews in Palestine. They were our neighbors. We don't have a problem. I wish we can go back to these days. Most probably there's going to be a big cycle of blood before that, but my job with my community is to do, maybe that's the way I can explain it to myself, because I do want to believe that all men were created equal, and I do want to believe that I don't think of the Israelis as bad or different, but maybe my job with my community, with myself as an artist, is to get us to a point where we find compassion even for our enemies. But it's impossible when you're being raped to compliment the nice hairdo of your raper.
Thank you. I think that answers that question. Thank you, Amir. And sometimes even 20 or 30 years into a peace process, you still can't walk off into the sunset. We have time for another 2 or 3 questions.
Hello, this is a question for Brendan. And I just wondered, as you described the commemoration of the rising and the fragments, how involved the dissident Republican groups are in that process. How engaged they are with it, because in a sense one is aware that the very sophisticated and controlled Sinn Féin political machine is not talking to them, and they feel marginalised, and they are still committed to the use of violence and have killed in recent times. And the other question, you refer to the loyalist communities, and I'm aware that as the grainy press photographs of the flag protests are being analysed, a lot of, and particularly young people, because young people, especially back to your point about young men, are the ones who take part in this, or as our technology analyses, they are gradually being picked up and receiving a criminal record. So as well as being unemployed and marginalised in the shadow of the walls, they now have criminal records and are not able to travel and will not get visas to America and so on and so forth. So how do you see that engagement with dissidents on both sides, first of all as a risk to the peace process, and how do you see it the way forward in engagement, and I acknowledge the arts as a way, but in terms of, and as Shona talked about, in terms of the era of cutbacks and tough economic times ahead, how do you see that dissident element as, you know, the potential for both positive and negative for the future?
Okay, there's a lot in that, but we'll go from this top. So in terms of the commemorations, it depends how who you classify as a dissident as well. As I mentioned before, there's 7 different commemorative events that take place in the Falls Road. And they stretch from Easter Sunday right the way through to Easter Monday. Now, only up until maybe a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, Irrigee would have been considered a dissident group. Now, if you speak to any member of Irrigee in Belfast, or you speak to a member of Irrigee in Dublin, where it was formed, they'll vehemently deny that they're a dissident group at all. So it's quite a loaded term in the first instance. Okay, yeah, no problem. Well, they're heavily suppressed. That would be the first thing. I mean, there was a real IRA commemoration in Derry a couple of years ago, and one in Newry that that was shut down, very violently shut down at the time. So there's not necessarily the space there to allow that discussion to be had or allow that commemoration to take place. The other point linked to that is you don't make friends with your friends, you make friends with your enemies. So you have to bring dissidents and you have to bring extremists to the table. You always have to dialogue with people. And that's my personal interpretation of it. You have to bring your enemies to the table. So it wasn't too long ago that other groups who are now in political power were considered white boys or dissidents and whatever. So they're now the people running the show. So that's the key thing there. With regards to the young men issue and the criminalisation, that's a huge problem. And I was working quite closely with a group called Alternatives in East Belfast, a restorative justice programme, working with Protestant young men who were subjected to the criminal justice system. But the programme was, you know, if you engage with this restorative justice programme, there was a way back. There was a way of not having your whole life screwed up for you, because that's what happens, and it becomes cyclical, and you become involved in violence time after time again. So absolutely, we need to be very careful about the criminalisation of young people, and unfortunately that is what is happening. There was something like 300 arrests in the summer following the flag protests, predominantly of young working class male Protestants, which it can't be good for moving forward at all. So hopefully that's answered the majority of your questions there. I can't speak to the arts and the theatre side of things, so maybe somebody else could take that point up. Or not.
Well, I don't think that was an arts question, really, was it? So. It's interesting. I have done a wee bit of work with the Spectrum Centre on the Shankill Road, and they do a lot of incredible work, and it's firmly community-based and grassroots. And that's about really starting to nurture, again, a sense of ownership around the arts and a sense of possibility and confidence. And another company I work with in London actually is called Clean Break, and they work with women in the criminal justice system. And similarly, questions arise all the time about what the value of that is. And these are women who are at risk or who have done time. And it's about confidence, it's about building skills. A lot of those skills are transferable skills. It's not about going on and putting a Chekhov on in, you know, a theatre. It's about being able to go into a job interview and hold your own and talk clearly and feel confident, you know. So again, I guess all I'm saying is that the benefits of the arts might not be immediately obvious sometimes, or they might work best in tandem with other skills and schemes and projects, you know. Yeah.
Can I just add one more point there? Marion Price was arrested at the Easter 1916 commemorations in Derry for taking part in an illegal dissident commemoration. So if that shows you the attitude towards dissidents commemorating at the same time as well.
And I'll just add a quick point as well, that I totally agree with Stacey's point that it is the community workers, especially in areas where we all know that young Protestant males are at the greatest risk of criminalisation. And the community workers are doing some incredible work there. There's a massive project going to happen in Derry through the arts. It's David Best, the artist, is doing a project called Temple in March of this year with Artichoke, and they're working with all the community leaders and with hundreds of young men to skill them up in carpentry skills. And then they're going to burn this incredible temple, which talks to the whole history of bonfires and the culture of bonfires. So it's one that's worth watching. But to me, always the problem comes back to the political leadership in those areas. And our experience through the City of Culture was there was much less interest in talking, particularly with the leaders in the loyalist community, in talking about the plight of young unemployed men. Than there was in discussing how many times have you said UK City of Culture in your literature versus City of Culture? How many times have you said Londonderry versus Derry or Dura Columcille? So I think there is still a sophistication in leadership that needs to be developed there if those young people are going to be properly serviced by their political representation.
I have a question for Amir. Thank you for a very profound and provocative piece. I'd like to ask you at whom you are aiming this piece, if you had any particular audience in mind when you set about writing it. We're ultimately presented with a picture of hopelessness, where Palestinians emerge with all their vitality sucked from them through incarceration and so on. Are you trying to shake Palestinians out of some inertia? Or are you trying to present a view of what is being done to Palestinians to the rest of the world by this incarceration within confined territory?
I wrote this during the war. In one of the evenings, there was a siren. And I have children, so we ran to we don't have a shelter, but we ran to our staircase. And my neighbor, whose family is in Gaza, was there as well, and we started chit-chatting. And I asked if he heard from them, and he said no. And then the siren was gone, and we went back to our respected houses. And the children went back to sleep. And I sat down and wrote this because I was trying to understand what it means to be in Gaza. What does it mean when you have no hope? Where do you go? Of course, you hope that somebody that will read it will be affected and think differently. But I think my initial instinct of writing this was releasing the fear of a siren coming from Gaza. The absurdity of this situation when you know that there's 1.7 million people that are bombarded and have nowhere to go, and they're asked to evacuate their houses, and they're bombarded on the way, and then they're bombarded on arrival to the new house. You know, it's a huge jail that's been bombarded when they're told to move. And I was so shaken by this siren that is almost symbolic, because the missiles coming out of Gaza are homemade and not very lethal. And we never took them that seriously. You know, I was mainly responsible because of my children. But nevertheless, even that shook me to the core. Shook all my safety. You know, we think we're surrounded by walls and everything's okay, and it takes what happened in the summer in London or what happens around the world in many places. You know, I'm not talking about Rwanda. It takes much less to make this all very fake. But to be living in a place where you're confined, even in your escape, even if in your dreams, I don't know if me writing this was an attempt to raise bells. It was an attempt to release fear, if that makes sense.
We can take one more question, I think we have time for.
Very brief. Abraham Lincoln is reputed to have greeted Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I quote, as the woman who caused the Civil War. Secondly, another opposite experience myself. 43 years ago in Clonmel, I saw a wonderful production of O'Casey's anti-war play, The Silver Tassie. I went to see it 3 evenings out of 4. My attitude to war could never be the same again. And a question to Amir then. We know what it's like, we have an idea what it's like on a military level, social, or on a legal level, etc. What is it like day-to-day living in a beleaguered situation? You said you were living close to people of the opposite side and so on. What's the day-to-day experience of living in that beleaguered situation? I'd love to know.
Confusing. You know, you're always torn between your political righteousness, and it is a certain amount of righteousness, and the fact that your neighbor is really nice and friendly and even sympathizes with you and is willing to help. And again, it's not about them. It's not about them as people. I don't have a problem with them as people, and they don't have a problem with me most of the time as people. But our political situation means that we're on different sides of the barricade. Sometimes this barricade is imaginary, and sometimes we're on the same side of a different barricade, because, you know, I'm closer to my secular, gay Israeli neighbor than I am to a Salafite Muslim in Ramallah. I am closer to him in my belief system, in my in a lot of things, I'm much closer to him. But at the same time, we have been locked in this battle that the world has decided that it's okay to keep us in this situation, because this is the longest war that's going on from 48. And until this is resolved, all my interactions with my neighbors will be poisoned by this in the core. It's always there. There's always, whenever two Palestinians meet, there's a third sitting there. He's called 1948. Whenever a Palestinian and Israeli meet, there's two absents. There's 1948 and there's 39 to 45, the Holocaust, the big Jewish trauma. And they are there. They're you know, you talk and they interfere in the middle of the conversation and say, no, 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 no. They are visible, they are real, they're not ideas, they're not even traumas, they're living people that sit with us everywhere. It's very hard to gap this. But it's impossible to gap until one situation isn't resolved in some manner. I don't think it could be resolved in absolute justice. You see, I've got some gray hair, I'm getting sensible. But it needs a full stop. It's an ongoing sentence. And it needs a full stop. And then we can start a new sentence. But we're hanging in air for 60-something years. And, you know, and the UN, now there's a new act of terror by the Palestinians. They're doing diplomatical terror, going to the UN for recognition. And the UN and the world are keeping it this way. And I can't blame them because they're busy with other things like making money. But I can't continue.
Thank you very, very much, everybody. If I can thank Amir, Stacey, and Brendan, and leave you all with a thought. Earlier this year, last year, I heard Albie Sachs speak in New York, and he talked about how an evening of readings from Lorca and Neruda were the opening to his political awakening and all of the incredible work he did in South Africa thereafter. Hearing Conall Morrison talk about how a visionary Attorney General in Belfast has brought Antigone into the discussions with ministers tells me that there is a point in writing a play. Thank you very, very much.